We've come a long way from the nadir of licensed games. When I was growing up, it was pretty much universally understood that any game based on a popular IP, like a movie, should be regarded with suspicion at best. If a licensed game turned out to actually be good, it was usually framed in terms of subverting those expectations. Of course, plenty of licensed games were actually good back then. You can probably think of a few off the top of your head. So on its own, that's not an especially novel point. But here's a thought that I had that's maybe a little more interesting. Looking back, it sometimes seems like the worst movies made the best games. Think about it. Ballistic X vs. Sever, a movie frequently featured on the IMDb Bottom 100, had a Game Boy Advance adaptation that was quite well received. But E.T.? I don't even need to finish that point, do I? For a more moderate example, here's one you almost certainly have in your head already. GoldenEye is generally considered far from the best Bond movie, if not outright terrible. The N64 game is considered one of the best games ever made. Meanwhile, From Russia with Love only ever had middling game adaptations, and Goldfinger never even had a full game of its own, only being featured as part of that weird 007 Legends thing. Of course, this is far from a consistent rule, and there are a million exceptions. For one, it's not like a Spielberg movie never got a good game adaptation, even in the time when good movie games were rarer. And plenty of bad movies get bad video games, or more commonly don't get games at all. Still, it is funny to think that for some bad films, the last chance to get something good out of the whole ordeal was found in a place that many people used to write off completely. And it got me thinking, what's the most extreme example I can find? What would happen if a game was made from a film often considered to be the worst ever made? Remarkably, I don't just have to speculate. In 1992, Irish developers Gremlin Graphics released a game based on the 1959 film Plan 9 from Outer Space, one of the first movies to really get widely discussed as potentially the worst ever made. And how is it? Well, I'm not going to bury the lead. It's no GoldenEye. But I think it's interesting enough to be worth talking about. First, I need to talk about the movie it's based on, of course. If you already have some familiarity with Plan 9, skip to this part of the video if you're so inclined. If not, let me say I feel incredibly lucky that I get to be the first person to tell you about this weird-ass movie and its equally weird-ass director. This is actually one of the first things I ever really got into when I was first learning about movies many years ago, so this means quite a lot to me. Starting with that director, Edward D. Wood Jr., Ed Wood for short. For our purposes, his story begins in the Pacific Theater of World War II. Wood, in his later years, would frequently embellish his days in the service, but one thing he said about those days seems, by all appearances, to have been true. And that is that Wood spent most of his time in the war wearing a bra and panties under his uniform. Yeah, I suspect I'll say this a few times over the course of this episode, but happy Pride, everybody. Wood, by all accounts, was actually straight, and in fact about as stereotypically masculine as you'd expect for a guy who fought in World War II. But in those days, wearing drag, regardless of your sexuality, would push you far into the fringes of society. And that tension is vital to understanding Wood's work, I think. His films play almost like parodies of the time in which they were made, but they were directed by a man who was ostracized by the society of his day, and who worked alongside people who also often were, sometimes much more than he was. That sounds like the recipe for compelling avant-garde filmmaking. And in a way, it actually was, the best example being a film Wood made a few years before Plan 9 called Glen or Glenda, which, in addition to being autobiographical in a way 50s films very rarely were, is also shockingly ahead of its time on the subject of trans identity.
But in time, Alan is Anne, a very happy, lovely young lady.
Happy Pride again, by the way. For the most part, though, one omnipresent problem got in the way of Wood ever being seen that way. And that is that he was an awful filmmaker. You'll see in greater detail once we start talking about Plan 9 proper, but suffice it to say, nearly everything that a filmmaker could do wrong, Wood did wrong. Exacerbated by the fact that, as someone working outside the Hollywood studio system, he had nearly complete creative control over his own work. To those of you who have never gotten into the whole watching bad movies for fun thing, this all may seem kind of weird to you. How does a movie sometimes considered the worst ever made end up more well-remembered than most good films from the era? People can get pretty philosophical about this, and I imagine I will by the end of this video, but for now I'll just say that if a movie is bad in the right ways, it can be very, very funny. Seriously, watch a movie like Plan 9 with some friends, preferably when you're all at least a little drunk, and you'll laugh hard enough to potentially hurt yourself. This video isn't a replacement for doing that, but hopefully it'll give you some ideas as to how wildly entertaining bad movies can be in a way good movies kinda can't be. So without further ado, let's talk about Plan 9 from Outer Space. Doing this like a standard movie review would be pointless, I think. Plan 9 doesn't operate the way most movies do. Instead, I'll start with a very bare-bones summary of the plot, and then we can get to the good stuff. Like a lot of low-budget 1950s movies, Plan 9 is about an alien invasion. A couple of aliens, by which I literally mean two, come down to Earth and use their alien technology to resurrect 3 zombies, yes, literally just 3, to attack the Earth. Their reason for doing so is that humanity is on the cusp of harnessing the energy of the sun to build a bomb powerful enough to destroy the entire universe. Like it always is in these movies, the alien invasion is defeated and the credits roll after a brisk 79 minutes. Not the worst setup in the world. Honestly, the whole aliens resurrect the undead thing doesn't sound bad at all at a glance, and could maybe be a cool way to bring together the sci-fi that was so popular at the time and the classic spooky horror that was popular a couple decades earlier, like the Universal monsters of the early 30s. But now we get to see how Ed Wood fucks it all up. I'm not going to show you everything because, frankly, there's a lot, and I don't want this video to run for like 3 hours. And I want you to be able to experience some of it fresh if you ever do decide to watch on your own. So we're going to do, let's say, around a half dozen moments, give or take, that I think are a good primer to this film. Starting from literally the first lines, read by the sorta famous at the time TV psychic Criswell.
Greetings, my friend. We are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives.
Is that supposed to be profound? Fun fact, actually, it's not. Criswell would say that on TV sometimes, but as a joke, usually followed by whether we want to or not. But Ed Wood, being impervious to irony, apparently thought it sounded super deep. Also, at the end of the narration, Criswell name drops the movie, but uses the working title.
My friend, can your heart stand the shocking facts about grave robbers from outer space?
Next thing I want to talk about isn't one moment, but rather something that runs through the entire movie. It concerns Bela Lugosi. If you're unfamiliar, he's the most famous actor to play Dracula, and is, as a result, literally the reason the Count from Sesame Street sounds the way he does. Lugosi features in Plan 9 and is even billed as a guest star. Which is odd, because he had been dead for 3 years when Plan 9 was released. You see, sometime before Lugosi's death, Wood shot some home movie footage of him and decided to use that here so he could credit Lugosi as an actor in Plan 9. Already a pretty crazy thing to do, but bafflingly, rather than just use the footage as a posthumous walk-on cameo, Wood actually incorporated it into the plot. Lugosi's character dies in an off-screen car accident, then is resurrected as a zombie. But of course, Wood didn't have any footage of Lugosi as a zombie, so he got, and if you've never heard this story, you may want to sit down first, his wife's chiropractor, who looked absolutely nothing like Lugosi, to pretend to be him by covering his face with his cape. This leads, at one point, to one of the most amazing sequences in film history. Absolutely seamless. Looks as good as that one fight in Sinners, doesn't it? If you've seen it, you know the one. Matter of fact, let's talk about the other zombies real quick. The second one, played by Vampira, one of the first TV movie hosts and a direct inspiration on Elvira, Happy Pride, is honestly one of the less embarrassing parts of the movie. She's not particularly scary, mostly because she makes this face a lot, but since her character never says anything, she doesn't get fed any of Wood's trademark weird dialogue. And honestly, casting a horror host for a role like this isn't a bad idea at all, since all she really needs is presence, which Vampira had plenty of time to develop during her time on TV. But the third zombie, played by the Swedish wrestler Tor Johnson, oh boy. 2 scenes with him are infamously bad. The first is the last scene before he gets zombified. For the record, allegedly Tor Johnson didn't have an especially thick accent in person. Maybe he was told to play it up for the cameras, maybe he was just camera shy, though come to think of it, that would be a little odd for a pro wrestler. Regardless, we end up with this.
Girl.
Medical examiner been around yet?
Just left. The morgue wagon ought to be along most any time.
You get their statement?
Yeah, much as we could. They're pretty scared.
Finding a mess like this ought to make anyone frightened. Have one of the boys take the guy and the girl back to town. You take charge.
Okay, Inspector. What are you going to do?
Look around a little.
You know, I mentioned the Count earlier, but now I'm thinking of a different Muppet for some reason. The other amazing scene is when he emerges from the grave as a zombie. I'll just let it play out and you can see if you spot the problem. Yeah, he's stuck. Now let's talk about the aliens. Two of them come to Earth, a female and male. The female, Tana, played by Joanna Lee. The male, Eros, played by Dudley Manlove. The Happy Pride? Actually, remarkably, among the alien actors, Dudley Manlove was not the gay one. That would actually be their leader on the mothership, played by Bunny Breckenridge. Once again, Happy Pride. As for the two aliens that end up on Earth, Tana doesn't do so much because, insert joke about the 50s here, but Eros has one iconically funny moment, a scene at the end where he's trying to explain to the human characters that they're about to create a solar energy bomb that will destroy the universe. The entire explanation scene is gold, though if you happen to be a physicist, make sure you protect your mental health if you decide to watch. But the standout is this bit at the end.
You see? You see? You're stupid minds. Stupid! Stupid! That's all I'm taking from you. Get back here, you...
In case you're wondering, there's no explanation for him just randomly acting like a child there. The last thing I want to talk about is the effects, important to any funny bad genre movie. Well, rather than talk about them, let me just show you. Yep. Don't even know what else to say, honestly. But I think that'll suffice for now. Like I said, I didn't mention nearly everything worth talking about, and fans of Plan 9 will notice that I've skipped some pretty iconic moments. But as I said, I wanted to give you a chance to experience at least some of this movie fresh if you ever decide to watch it. Incidentally, if you do, it's in the public domain and thus available on a bunch of sites, including YouTube. I recommend getting some friends together and just dropping this movie on them without context. That's often led to amusing results when I've tried it. Before moving on to the game, though, I think it's necessary to answer a question a lot of people ask when Plan 9 gets brought up. Is it really the worst movie ever made? You might be able to tell my opinion from the fact that I put worst movie ever made in quotation marks in the title of this video. Plan 9 is far from the worst movie ever made. Even if we narrow our scope to movies that are bad in a funny way, Plan 9 isn't the worst of those either. What Plan 9 is one of the first movies to be considered the worst, all the way back in 1980 in a book called The Golden Turkey Awards, written by film critic and political pundit Michael Medved. In fairness, less was known about film history 45 years ago, so many of the other famously bad movies hadn't been discovered, and quite a few hadn't even been made yet. But I think there's potentially another reason. Medved is famously homophobic. And while I have no way of confirming this, I think it's entirely possible that Plan 9 being directed by a man who frequently wore drag and hung out with LGBT people was a determining factor in him putting it at the top of his list. Of course, regardless, in doing so, Medved inadvertently helped create a minor queer icon, so, once again, happy Pride. Now on to the game. I actually will describe this in full, both because it's pretty short and because, honestly, it's not something you absolutely have to check out yourself. First, though, a note about the music you're hearing. Plan 9, at least the DOS version that I'm playing right now, does technically have music. It has one crummy 10-second MIDI that loops the entire time. So for the sake of your sanity and mine, I'll play some other music in the background throughout. It'll make everything a lot less unpleasant, and it'll allow me to cut to different parts of the footage, as well as pause it if need be, without it coming off as awkward. Anyway, the game starts with Tor Johnson asking us what language we speak, followed by a cute opening credit sequence styled after the opening credits of the film. Love the computography credit as a play on cinematography in particular. Then we find ourselves in an office where Tor Johnson, again, tells us that he lost the reels of his new movie and that he'll pay us handsomely if we can find them. Which is odd because Tor Johnson was never a producer. There's a poster on the back of the wall for I Changed My Sex, an alternate title for Glen or Glenda, so maybe he's meant to represent that film's producer, George Weiss. But for reasons you'll see fairly quickly, I don't think it's quite that deep. Anyway, whoever he is, he has a face like a Swedish wrestler, he produces films, and he needs us to find one that he's lost. But first, of course, we need to get past the standard for the time copy protection question. If you've played enough old DOS games, you'll recognize this. I answered it by tracking down a PDF copy of the manual, which explains pretty well on its own why games don't use this kind of copy protection anymore. And with that, we're off. We head out of the studio, and after getting our bearings and fumbling around with the frankly kinda awkward navigation, find ourselves at a bar, where something becomes clear. Because the bartender is also Tor Johnson. Nearly every male character in the game, in fact, is Tor Johnson. Bit of an odd choice, but I'll admit it made me laugh when I first saw it. At the bar is someone calling themselves Edwina. Obviously this is meant to be Ed Wood himself, or at least his drag persona, but just for the record, Wood's real-life drag persona was not named Edwina, but rather Shirley. Weirdly, despite being based on the IRL director of Plan 9, Edwina doesn't seem to have had any hand in the creation of the film we're looking for, simply telling us that Bela Lugosi allegedly had a copy and that his house is on Vlad the Impaler Street. We talk to bartender Tor and immediately buy some booze because this is a PC adventure game from the 90s, so it's a requirement that we get literally all the things, even if we don't have a clear reason to at the time. It's $15, which is absolutely absurd if this game is meant to be set in the 50s, though it probably isn't. Returning to the producer's office, producer Tor is now gone, and we examine his desk to find a key that, as far as I can tell, is invisible. Yes, that's bullshit even by the standards of adventure games of the time, and yes, I used a walkthrough to figure that out. In the producer's private room, there are some photos on the wall, which means I get to talk more about weird B-movie history. One of the photos depicts Tura Satana, an actress famous for her work in the films of Russ Meyer, in particular the leading role of Varla in Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, a film that is unironically pretty good. The other photo depicts Roberta Findlay. The comment underneath refers to a part, which is odd because Findlay was herself always behind the camera, both as a director on films such as The Oracle and a cinematographer on films such as the amazingly named Shriek of the Mutilated. I'll admit I've never gotten super into her work, but she definitely has her devotees among exploitation film fans. Either way, both are charming references, but neither are really germane to a game about the work of Ed Wood, barring maybe the connection that in his later years, Wood, to his own deep shame, would make films about as sexually explicit as what Russ Meyer and Roberta Findlay made, including at times outright pornography. Given that that part of his career is sometimes credited with worsening the alcohol abuse that contributed to Wood's early death of a heart attack, I really hope that's not the connection they're trying to make. Anyway, the third photo, the one which is actually needed to advance the game, shows a picture of Vampira, remember her, with an address written in the corner. We return to the foyer and ask the Tor Johnson doorman to hail us a taxi. The taxi driver also looks like Tor Johnson, but oddly only from the front. We take the taxi to the address from the picture, which takes us to a cemetery. We go inside the crypt, and there in an open coffin is the body of Bela Lugosi. Honestly, it's a little tasteless, especially the steak pun the game throws out upon examining his body. But if I were unilaterally opposed to every flippant reference to Bela Lugosi being dead, I wouldn't be able to listen to Bauhaus, so I'll let this slide, I guess. Examining the body gives us a key to Bella's house, and we take the hammer on the floor on our way out. We return to the taxi and head to Bella's house on Vlad the Impaler Street, which honestly looks spookier than the crypt he was buried in. In his study, we find an ad for a local shopping mall, a photo of Bela himself, and behind a deer's head mounted on the wall, a credit card. That's the second significant item so far, which, to the best of my knowledge, isn't signposted in any way. Examining the credit card reveals a string of numbers scrawled on the back, clearly not the card number itself. Back to the taxi, the mall is now selectable, so we head there. We take the elevator to the second floor, where we find some kind of horror-themed curio shop, seemingly run by Vampira. We buy the mask, paying for it with our new credit card. Examining the mask gives us a note and a small key. The note just has another bad pun on it, but the key will come in handy later. Back to the elevator, we visit the travel agency on floor 3 and book a flight to Rio with the Tor Johnson travel agent. Not sure why this game, based on the work of a guy who only made films within the US, is apparently a globe-trotting adventure now, but there you go. We go up to the 5th floor, to a hardware store, and buy a spade from the Tor Johnson redneck. We then put our passport in the Xerox machine that's on the counter for some reason, and we get a photo of ourselves. Floor 6 is the bank, and we first get the Vampira bank teller to give us some foreign currency for a few different places, one of which, oddly, is Washington? With that squared away, we hand her the small key and give her the number we found on the credit card, actually with 2 digits out of order, and I'm honestly unsure if that's a small puzzle or just a typo. Inside the safe deposit box is our first film reel, examining which reveals that it's labeled 1, W-U-N. We head back to the cemetery and use our new spade to dig up a grave located to the left of the crypt. Inside the grave is another film reel, this one labeled Of. We take the taxi to the airport and give our ticket to the Vampira airline representative. I am noticing a pattern similar to one we've already seen before. We board the plane and head up to the cockpit, where, in a nice touch, it's directly styled after the famously awful cockpit set from the film. We make some small talk with the pilot, who oddly isn't Tor Johnson, and he tells us the hotel he usually stays at in Rio, and that he seems to have left something there. We will, obviously, be on the lookout for it, but also obviously, when we find it, we will not give it back to him. We take the taxi to the hotel and check the registry for the pilot's name. Turns out he last stayed in room 21, so we tell the Vampira receptionist that we'd like to stay there. On the dresser is the pilot's ID, which we take. We then slide our own photo that we made back at the hardware store into the ID, which doesn't seem like it would work ever in a million years, but there you go. Heading to a nearby cave, we nearly get attacked by bats, but they see our photo of Bela Lugosi, and being big fans, they take it from us and leave us alone to grab the film reel inside, this one labeled Low, L-O. A cheesy moment, but honestly kinda cute. Upon making it back to the airport, we're accosted by the Tor Johnson corrupt Brazilian police force, and upon refusing to bribe them, we're tried in a kangaroo court by the Tor Johnson judge and sent to jail. Also, some of the names and word choices in this part used make me think the devs don't entirely understand the difference between Brazil and Mexico, but I digress. In jail, we give the Tor Johnson prison guard the rum we've been holding on to for most of the game, and he leaves, dropping a statue on the way out. We smash the statue with the hammer we found in Bella's crypt, and inside it is a pupa for some reason. Anyway, our business in Brazil concluded, we return home. Once home, we head to the pilot's house, the address of which we found on his ID, and do that one trick with our credit card to unlock the door. Inside is some scuba gear, which we take, and in the backyard is another film reel, this one labeled Property. We head back to the studio and in the storeroom pick up some beads and attempt to pick up a dictionary. Apparently you're supposed to be able to pick up both, but when I went to pick up the dictionary, Tor Johnson producer stopped me, so for now we just have the beads. Back in the foyer, we hail another taxi, though this time we have to bribe the Tor Johnson doorman. We take the taxi to the airport and give our forged pilot ID to the attendant, which somehow works. We're heading to Australia this time. When we get to Australia, the taxi driver is wearing a Crocodile Dundee hat, because of course he is. The driver takes us to the Sydney Opera House, because of course he does, and we head to the nearby beach and meet a Vampira beach babe. We give her the beads we found at the studio, and because this isn't Mardi Gras, this video doesn't risk demonetization, and she takes us to meet her hippie friends. I gotta say, the Tor Johnson hippie is at least my second favorite Tor Johnson in the entire game. We make some seemingly pointless small talk and then leave, taking the airplane home. Heading back to the studio, we're finally able to pick up the dictionary from the storeroom, then we hit the streets and pick up a balloon from the table of a nearby diner. Certainly not the worst pixel peeping we've had to do in this game, but still pretty rough, especially with the small window the game runs in to make room for all the commands. We then head to a building site where one of the workers compliments us on our tan. We say that we got it in Australia, though I'm not sure how since we were barely there for any time at all, and he mentions that he used to be part of a hippie commune in Australia. We know exactly what commune he's talking about, so it looks like we're heading back there to send them his regards. On the other side of the Opera House is a bridge being painted by another person in a Crocodile Dundee hat, because of course he is. We try to talk to him, but he can't hear us, and as we lean closer to ask him if he was in that one Crocodile movie, because of course we do, we fall into the water. We immediately use the scuba gear, and you get to see what my favorite Tor Johnson face in the whole game is. Behold, the Tor Johnson fish!
It's beautiful!
Amazing. Worth the price of admission alone, honestly. Though admittedly, that's probably because I paid literally nothing for this game. Anyway, we take the crowbar from the sea floor, then use the balloon with the scuba gear, which for some reason causes us to rocket out of the water all the way back to the Opera House. We head back to the commune and give Fred's regards to the hippies, and the Tor Johnson hippie gives us a reel of film to give back to Fred. We will, of course, not be giving it back to Fred. This one is labeled HK, by the way. HK, appropriately enough, is where we're headed next. We take the plane to Hong Kong, and the taxi driver, who, yes, is wearing the stereotypical hat of a Chinese rice farmer, takes us to the home of a movie mogul. The mogul isn't especially talkative since he's lost his family's prized netsuke, basically a Japanese form of miniature sculpture. Might sound weird that it's in the possession of a Hong Konger, and it's entirely possible that that's another example of the developers not being very aware of cultural differences, but Japanese art has made its way into Hong Kong for many, many years, so it's at least a plausible scenario. At least more plausible than some of the other things we've seen. With nothing else to do in Hong Kong, we head to Washington, D.C. And this is when the game gets weird. Buckle up. The taxi driver takes us to the White House, where we're immediately greeted by the elder President Bush, who makes a pun on his "read my lips, no new taxes" line that I'm sure someone found funny when this game was released in 1992. Then a Tor Johnson CIA agent pushes Bush aside and tells us that we're needed for a top-secret mission. You know, having Tor Johnson as the head of the CIA actually makes some sense. We're going undercover into Cuba. Why? Well, I'll let Tor explain. We here at the CIA believe that those commies are actually aliens from outer space, and that they are trying to subvert our youth with purple breakfast cereals with funny-shaped marshmallow bits. You know, that is ridiculous, but compared to some of the shit the real-life CIA did, that's maybe like the middle of the pack. We're also told to bring back some items of Cuban merchandise for study. What do you think the over-under is that one of the things we bring back is a Cuban cigar? We speak to the Tor Johnson immigration official, who asks us a bunch of nonsensical questions, our answers to which don't matter. We end up getting called un-American and deported, and every joke I could make about this would be way too dark given current events, so I will refrain from making one. Upon our arrival in Cuba, we find ourselves face to face with Fidel Castro himself. Sadly not Tor Johnson Fidel Castro, which would probably have made me piss myself laughing, who starts shouting at us in Spanish. Thankfully we have our dictionary, so we read it and find out that Castro is a baseball fan. Which, oddly for this game, is actually accurate, both to Castro himself and to Cuban culture more broadly, which is a country with a well-documented, real-life love for baseball. Weirdly, he doesn't seem to see us read from a dictionary right in front of him, since he compliments us on our Spanish fluency and gives us 2 items. One of which is a poster, the other of which, you guessed it, is a box of Cuban cigars. Back in DC, somehow, we give the cigars and the poster to the agent at the White House, who tells us we may find what we're looking for at the Smithsonian. The taxi takes us there, and at first the Tor Johnson curator wants nothing to do with us. But when we show him the pupa that we found in Brazil, he gets excited and leaves, giving us the freedom to explore. We head to the warehouse and look through some of the packing crates, one of which is labeled Hong Kong. We do have somebody in Hong Kong who lost something, so it's worth a try. We use the crowbar on the crate, and the Netsuke is there, along with another reel, this one labeled Song. We head back to Hong Kong and give the movie mogul the Netsuke. He gives us a talisman of some kind for our trouble. Then we head to the border with China and find ourselves on the Great Wall, which, by the way, is nowhere near Hong Kong, and get attacked by ninjas who, by the way, if you somehow don't know this, are not Chinese. The ninjas actually lead us to a group of Buddhist monks, and we give one of them the talisman, who says we can now achieve nirvana. We find ourselves in an honestly quite pretty landscape, and we see a movement command at the top of the screen that we haven't seen before. Go to aliens. So we go. And lo and behold, aliens arrive in flying saucers, actually kinda resembling those from the movie. The aliens themselves, however, do look quite a bit better than the humans in weird costumes that the film used. One of the aliens then tells us that Tor Johnson producer was actually an evil alien, and the film reels contained the battle plans that he stole from them, so in finding the film reels and bringing them here, we have unknowingly saved the universe. The alien then says that they consider taking us to, apparently, some kind of freaky sex planet, but they determine that the experience would have likely killed us, so we avoid death by snoo-snoo, which I guess is either a happy ending or a sad one, depending on your perspective. The alien concludes by telling us to keep watching the skies, a reference to the classic sci-fi film The Thing from Another World, famously remade by John Carpenter as The Thing.
I bring you a warning. Every one of you listening to my voice, tell the world. Tell this to everybody wherever they are. Watch the skies, everywhere. Keep looking. Keep watching the skies.
A great movie and a cute reference, but it has really nothing to do with Plan 9 apart from being a sci-fi film made in the same decade. The alien then returns to their flying saucer, and the game ends by, as all schlocky DOS games do, kicking us right back to the DOS prompt barely a second after the end screen pops up. So, yeah. I think it's fair to say, not a great game. It has its moments, but for the most part it plays like an amalgamation of all the worst aspects of graphical adventure games from the early 90s. Obtuse, illogical, poorly written apart from some occasionally decent jokes. Plan 9 the game simply does almost everything wrong. But then again, Plan 9 the movie also did almost everything wrong, and it ended up so fun that I actively recommended you give it a watch. Would I do the same for this game? No. Not even a little bit. And the reason why, I think, is actually worth talking about. That reason being that it is much harder to make a funny bad video game than it is to make a funny bad movie. A movie is experienced, for lack of a better word, passively. You sit there and the movie happens in front of you always the same each time. So when a movie does something poorly, even egregiously poorly, it's possible to find yourself in a headspace where you're amused by that, since the moment, however long, will eventually end without any input on your part. Video games, meanwhile, require input. And a bad moment in a video game can bring the whole game to a halt. You feel bad design in a video game, often viscerally. And though adventure games are generally less interactive than most other games, Plan 9 the game's frequent refusal to make any kind of sense is frustrating even when playing with a walkthrough, in a way that the film's constant ridiculousness never is. To use an appropriate metaphor, it's funny to watch Tor Johnson get stuck in a hole. It's significantly less funny to be stuck in a hole yourself. That said, funny bad games are possible. You may even have some examples yourself. Personally, I think most, though not nearly all, funny bad games fall into roughly one of three categories. The first is games that are ultimately good, or at least average, but have some mostly harmless weirdness to make them funny. Staying within the adventure game genre, something like Harvester comes to mind, which certainly has its flaws, but comes together mostly competently-ish, and is also completely insane. And if you're as big a fan of Civ 11 as I am, you'll be familiar with his term Slavjank, referring to the sometimes quite odd, low-budget games made in Eastern Europe. Often those games are just outright bad, but sometimes, like Vivisector or You Are Empty, they work well enough as games that the silliness enhances the experience. Depending on your perspective, this could also include games like Goat Simulator, which do that on purpose, but I don't count them for the same reason that I don't count Sharknado as a funny bad movie. They're parodies, and should be judged on their merits as intentional comedies rather than unintentional ones. Another good example, a fitting one since Summer Games Done Quick is coming up, is to be found in bad games that become popular with speedrunners. After all, speedrunning is frequently about breaking games, so a game that's easy to break or broken to begin with as a result of bad design can become legitimately pretty fun to speedrun, and often very fun to watch. The third example, one the bulk of my subscribers will potentially be familiar with, is that of bad fighting games. Fighting games are based entirely on interaction between two players, so a bad fighting game that's equally bad for both players can be a weirdly fun form of competition, especially if neither player is taking it too seriously. Now, all of those categories have asterisks. In the first category, of course, those games aren't actually bad, just kinda weird. Regarding bad games as speedruns, the majority of people who engage with those do so by watching the runs rather than playing the games, and thus experience those in much the same way as they would a funny bad movie. And bad fighters, I think, still require at least some decent mechanical baseline to be worth playing at all. Like, yes, Fist of the North Star has those absurd infinites, but at its core, it plays pretty well. It's an Arxis game, after all. And even with all that said, you might still have a funny bad game that doesn't fit neatly into one of these categories. Maybe you have something totally out of left field. If you do, then by all means drop it in the comments, preferably after hitting that subscribe button on your way down there. Regardless, I hope you found this little case study interesting. If nothing else, I think it serves to illustrate the usefulness of being multidisciplinary, that is to say, learning about other art forms to reach a better understanding of the one you're most interested in. We're in a time when a lot of people are asking this question, what makes games unique? And I think answering that question is contingent on understanding what makes other art forms unique. And as a film school graduate who's loved video games since I was 5 years old, I hope I've added something, however small and ancillary, to that discussion. But more than anything, I hope you learned something today. See you next time. The alien concludes by telling us to keep watching the skies, a reference to the classic sci-fi film The Shit from My Other Ass, famously remade by John Carpenter as The Ass